In this lecture, we'll look at the sort of fundamentals of ethics as they appear in Vaughan's chapter, Moral Reasoning and Bioethics. The idea is to look at two basic questions in ethics, which is what is ethics and what are norms? And so under the first question, we'll talk about what the difference between morality and ethics, and then we'll also talk about different branches of ethics. And then when it comes to norms, there are different kinds of norms, so we want to be clear about what we mean when we use that term, and then also features of different moral norms, because in ethics, those are the ones that we're most concerned with. I'm confident that you've heard the terms morality, morals, ethics, ethical before. You've probably used them interchangeably. Strictly speaking, they aren't the exact same thing. I'm not going to chastise you if you use ethical and moral in interchangeable ways, but we want to be as exact and precise in philosophy, so it's important to just clarify what the distinction is. So morality corresponds to the beliefs that we have about what's right and wrong actions, or what counts as good or bad character. Whereas ethics is the actual study of morality using the tools and methods of philosophy. So ethics is the study of, and morality is sort of the specific claims about what's right and wrong, good or bad. So to give you an example here, on your screen you'll see the sort of comical, there is no dire emergency. Do you accept your duty to return the cart even though you gain nothing from it, right? I'm sure that most of us have gone to a grocery store and you see that there are carts populated throughout the parking lot that are not returned to the corral, and your first instinct might be, oh, that's a terrible person. Like, a good person would put their cart away. That would be a judgment about right and wrong actions or good and bad people, so that would be a concern about morality. But if you've ever seen or heard of the shopping cart theory, the whole idea is that, would self-governance work? Well, people struggle to just return their shopping cart to the corral, so obviously we can't just depend on everybody to self-govern. It's neither here nor there. It's not important. I'm not going to test you on the shopping cart theory, but the shopping cart theory is an instance of ethics. It's taking what we judge to be good and bad actions, putting them in a theory, and evaluating the different reasons for why we think it's right or wrong, good or bad. So here, looking at our example of returning a cart, we might say something about the person or something about the act. That would be morality. But if we want to base a whole theory off of it, that's when we start getting into ethics. You also heard the term ethical, so this is related, sort of the bridge between ethics and morality. So certain actions or character traits are consistent with a theory of morals. That's the idea here. So if you say somebody returning their cart, that's ethical. Why is it ethical? Because we have a theory that says why returning your cart is right and not returning your cart is wrong, or why returning your cart makes you a good person and not returning it makes you a bad person. So that's the differences between morality, ethics, and ethical. Again, if you use them interchangeable, I'm not going to take off points or anything like that. It's just important to understand the nuances so we can be more deliberate with what our arguments and what we're trying to convey with our discussions. So in ethics, we have three general branches. The first one is normative ethics, and in there we're sort of just trying to lay out the different justifications for why certain acts are right or wrong, why certain norms are appropriate or inappropriate. This is more generally what we think of when we think of the history of ethics, and in the next week we'll talk about different ethical theories. And so when we think about normative ethics, we're thinking about examples like utilitarianism, deontology, contract theory, things like that, in which we're trying to give general interpretations of what counts as right or wrong, or what counts as a good or bad character. Metaethics is going beyond normative ethics to ask questions that are like, what counts as right? What counts as a person, which we'll talk about when we get to the abortion week. And what does it mean for a person to be good? And so that is a meta-ethical conversation, and those are different topics that you might have or engage with. And then there is applied ethics, which is using these moral norms and concepts to resolve more practical moral issues. And so this is where bioethics belongs. It's an applied ethics because we are presented with specific situations in which we're trying to use the principles, the concepts, the theories, the frameworks to sort of navigate those situations to arrive at an answer of what's right and wrong action, or what's a good or bad character. Now that you know that ethics is principally concerned with the study of norms, you might be asking yourself, well, what's a norm? When you hear the term norm, think normal. Norms are just the acceptable standards of conduct or behavior. They're what we think is sort of like right and wrong within different arenas. And so we have different types of norms that we can differentiate, because not all of them are moral, not all of them are ones that really have any moral weight to them. So first one being aesthetic norms. If you're an artist, you might be familiar with color theory. I am not an artist. I am terrible at drawing at anything. So yeah. But if you're an artist, you might look at somebody's drawing or and say, well, they didn't use color theory appropriately, and so they violated these different aesthetic norms. Aesthetic just meaning like perception, things like that. So that's one set of norms. You also have etiquette norms. I'm going to give the example of like offering a guest a drink of water or something to drink, right? These are just like what's proper etiquette. You have grammatical norms. There are a number of them. So the Oxford comma here, right, where you place the comma sort of dictates how the sentence is interpreted. But there are also other types of grammatical norms, like don't end a sentence with a preposition or things like that. So those are grammatical norms. Then you have prudential norms. I think the most obvious one in this case would be, driving on a certain side of the road. Is it necessarily right or wrong to drive on one side of the road? Well, sure, but it's right and wrong because those are established, and if you don't drive on the right side of the road, then it leads to disaster and injury because people can collide with one another. So these are just prudential norms, norms about things that are constructed in the world that make it more safe to navigate. Then you have legal norms, and you'll see on the screen a number of different interesting, bizarre laws of the United States. Some of them are not in practice anymore, but the idea is that there are different laws in place. If you violate those norms, then there are different repercussions for them. One of the important takeaways from an ethics course, especially an applied ethics course, is that legal and moral are not the same thing. You can make a law about people who, you can make a law that says nobody's allowed to wear blue shoes. Does that mean that blue shoes are inherently wrong or right on a moral sense? No, not really. It just means that that's the way the law has been written and it's enforceable in that way. So just make sure that you know that legal and moral are different. I'm not saying that if you think that one thing is morally correct and but violates a legal norm, I'm not telling you to go violate a bunch of laws. So please don't go do that. But the idea is that legal and moral can correspond to two completely different sets of norms, and it's important to be able to differentiate them. So the final set is the one that we're going to be the most concerned with, which is moral norms. If you've ever heard the song Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads, congratulations, you have a great taste in music. If you haven't, go look it up, because you probably have heard it once or twice. But there's a great line in that song where he's asking himself, am I right, am I wrong? That's what a moral norm is. These are the types of norms related to the questions of what is considered right or wrong action and what's considered good or bad character traits. That's the distinction that we have to do here. We can talk about character, we can talk about action. We'll do more of that next week, but there's it's important to keep those terms separate, because again, we're we're trying to be as precise as we can be with our language. Finally, I just want to look at the list of features of moral norms that Vaughan gives us. I don't think that this list is necessarily exhaustive, but it's a really good starting point for understanding how we should engage with different theories and different arguments. So the first feature is normative dominance. And what Vaughan means by this is that certain moral norms will override others. And this is probably best fleshed out with an example. So think of a psychiatrist. They have an obligation to uphold confidentiality with their patients. But if a patient expresses an intent to harm somebody else, the psychiatrist also has an obligation to contact the authorities. So in this situation, the psychiatrist might have an obligation to confidentiality, but that's overridden by the psychiatrist's obligation to contact the authorities if somebody is in harm's way. So that's what we mean by normative dominance. I also just want to say on this point, when you're looking at the case study assignment later in the semester, what I'm really looking for you to do when you're evaluating the case study is to sort of see how the different concepts interact with one another and how different moral norms might play off of one another with respect to the case, and then express why you think one moral norm or one concept overrides the other one. Why should we give more consideration to one rather than the other? And so I think that's a really good basis for a conversation within that case study. So just bookmark that for later. The second feature that Vaughan brings up is universality. And so universality is just all about consistency. The idea is that if you give me a list or set of principles or judgments, that they all apply in relevantly similar situations. So if you were to consult a different ethical theory about what is right and wrong action, and then you give them one example, and then you give them another example that is very similar to the first one, it should give you a similar conclusion, a similar judgment, a similar evaluation of the case. And so that's just all about consistency, that an ethical theory shouldn't just give you different conclusions based on similar evidence. The third feature is impartiality, which is just mean that there isn't bias in the theory itself, that everyone should be considered equal and that everyone's interests should count the same. Now, it's important to stress that this doesn't mean that everybody should necessarily get treated equally all the time. As Vaughan talks about later in this chapter, he brings up the Rachel's quote about Tom Cruise playing Martin Luther King Jr. in a movie. The idea is that it's not that everybody gets treated equally all the same, but everybody gets treated equally when there is no good reason not to do so. So if you're going to say that different rules apply to different people, then you're going to have to articulate a reason for it. So the idea isn't just to say that everybody's equal because everybody's equally a person, although a lot of ethical theories might use that as a basis, and then sort of become more specific as we look at the different stakeholders that are involved. But this whole idea of impartiality is just that unless we have a good reason to show bias or have a different set of moral norms that apply to one group over a different group, we have to give a convincing reason for that. Which leads us to the final feature, which is reasonableness, that when we talk about these different moral arguments, we should have a set of reasons that convince us that one argument is better than the other. And so we can talk about obligations, values, and these different ways in which our moral arguments ultimately convince us that, yes, that's why we think that one act is right or one set of character traits are good. And we'll talk a little bit more about what a moral argument is and what its components are, but just for now, we're just talking about reasonableness, that there's a sort of a thread of logic that connects us connects the dots for us. So just to review, we started this lecture by looking at the differences between morality and ethics. To be specific, morality refers to the rightness and wrongness of actions or the goodness or badness of a person's character, whereas ethics is the systematic study of morality. So when you think ethics, think like the science of morality. As I mentioned in the previous slide, these two terms are often conflated, at least when we talk about ethical and moral. I'm not going to think any less of you if you use them interchangeably, but it's important to recognize that there is a difference between them. So if you're trying to be more precise, be sure to keep those differences in mind. Then we talked about there being three different branches of ethics. The first one being normative, second one metaethics, and the third one applied. Bioethics is a type of applied ethics. Then we shifted to what norms are, and so norms are just acceptable standards of behavior or conduct within a certain setting. And why I have that certain setting qualification there in that line is because not all norms are moral. We saw a number of different types of norms like aesthetic, etiquette, grammatical, legal, prudential. So not all of them are moral norms. And then finally, we just talked about how there are four different features of moral norms: the norm of dominance, universality, impartiality, and reasonableness.